The town of Blackwood, Pennsylvania was a place the American dream forgot. In its prime, the Blackwood Steel Mill employed half the county. But by 2014, it was nothing more than a rusted cathedral of dead industry sprawling across 300 acres of frozen earth. The locals didn't go near it. They said the soil itself was poisoned, but the real reason was the silence. It was a heavy, suffocating silence that felt like it was watching you. That was the silence Ethan stepped into. Ethan was 32, a senior electrical engineer from a high-end firm in Manhattan. He worked with pristine data centers and smart grids. He wore tailored coats and drank expensive coffee. But the German conglomerate that just bought the Blackwood property paid a fortune, so here he was, standing in the freezing, cavernous belly of a factory that had been dead for over 20 years. His job was straightforward but massive. Assess the old power grid, tear out the obsolete garbage, and prepare the facility for a state-of-the-art logistics hub. To do this, he was given a crew of local roughnecks led by a massive gray-bearded foreman named Marcus. Marcus didn't talk much. In fact, none of the local guys did. They did their work, kept their heads down, and always left before the sun went down. It was a Tuesday in late November. The temperature outside was in the single digits, and inside the concrete walls of the factory, it felt even colder. The dampness seeped into his bones. By 4 p.m., the pale sunlight filtering through the grime-caked skylights began to fade, casting long, twisted shadows across the factory floor. "All right, let's hit sub 4 before we pack it up," Ethan announced, his breath pluming in the freezing air. Marcus grunted, adjusting his hard hat. "Sub 4 is deep in Sector B, boss. It's dark as pitch down there. You sure you don't want to wait until morning?" "We are behind schedule, Marcus. We just need to run a basic diagnostic on the main distribution boards. 20 minutes, tops." Sub 4 wasn't just a room. It was a concrete bunker located in the basement level of the main processing plant. Walking down the metal-grated stairs, Ethan felt the air grow noticeably heavier. The smell was distinctive, a mix of ancient machine oil, wet concrete, and the sharp metallic tang of ozone. Inside the bunker stood the MDBs, the main distribution boards. There were 4 of them, standing shoulder to shoulder like steel coffins set on end. They were huge, over 7 feet tall and 3 feet deep, coated in thick industrial gray paint that was now peeling and scarred with rust. These cabinets were designed to take raw, high-voltage power from the outside grid and distribute it to the massive machines on the factory floor. Even though the factory was abandoned, the local power company had temporarily re-energized the main lines so Ethan's team could map the circuits. The boards were live. Ethan stepped up to the first cabinet. He held a heavy maglite in one hand and a thermal imaging camera in the other. He unlatched the door. Creak! Cabinet 1. Breakers open, bus bars intact, Ethan muttered into his voice recorder. The low, deep hum of 480-volt, 3-phase electricity vibrated through the concrete floor, traveling up his boots. It was a sound you didn't just hear, you felt it in your teeth. He moved to the next. Cabinet 2, clear. Then the next. Cabinet 3, clear. Everything was eerily intact for a place abandoned so long ago. Ethan stepped up to Cabinet 4. It was tucked into the darkest corner of the bunker. The shadows here seemed thicker, swallowing the light from his maglite. He grabbed the heavy metal latch. It was cold, freezing actually, much colder than the ambient temperature of the room. He yanked it upward and pulled the heavy steel door open. The hinges shrieked, a sound like a dying animal, echoing off the concrete walls. Ethan pointed his flashlight inside to inspect the copper bus bars, thick, bare metal rods carrying lethal amounts of electricity. But his beam didn't hit copper. It hit the dirty rubber sole of a work boot. Ethan froze. His heart skipped a painful beat, slamming against his ribs. He slowly angled the flashlight upward. The space behind the bus bars was incredibly narrow, maybe 2 feet wide at most. But someone was in there. It was a man. He was sitting on the bottom of the cabinet, his knees pulled tightly to his chest, his arms wrapped around his legs. He was wearing an old-school, faded blue mechanic's coverall. The fabric was charred, melted to the skin in places, with jagged burn holes revealing something dark underneath. Ethan couldn't breathe. His brain tried to process the impossible physics of the situation. He is behind the bus bars. If this man moved even half an inch forward, he would touch the bare copper. 480 volts and 4,000 amps would vaporize him instantly. "Hey," Ethan whispered, his voice trembling so violently he barely recognized it. "Hey, don't move! The power is live! Don't fucking move!" The figure didn't flinch. He sat perfectly still like a discarded mannequin. Ethan's hand shook uncontrollably, the beam of the flashlight dancing frantically over the man's charred clothing. "Marcus, get the main breaker, now!" Ethan screamed over his shoulder, not daring to take his eyes off the man. Slowly, with an unnatural grinding stiffness that sounded like dried leather twisting, the man lifted his head. Ethan staggered backward, the flashlight nearly slipping from his sweaty grip. The man's face was a nightmare. It was a road map of horrific, blackened burn scars. The lips were melted away, exposing a permanent, gruesome grin of scorched teeth. But the eyes were what made Ethan's stomach heave. There were no irises, no pupils, just milky, glowing pools of white that seemed to catch the flashlight's beam and reflect it back with terrifying intensity. The man stared dead at Ethan. Suddenly, the ambient, vibrating hum of the electrical current began to shift. The steady bzzz of the live voltage started to warp, pitching up and down, distorting into an impossible sound. The electricity itself was forming words. It was a raspy, dry whisper that bypassed Ethan's ears and echoed directly inside his skull. "Shut it down." "Jesus Christ!" Ethan shouted, dropping the flashlight. It hit the concrete floor with a loud crack, the beam spinning wildly across the ceiling. He stumbled backward, his boots catching on an old cable, and he hit the floor hard.
"Boss! Ethan!" Heavy footsteps pounded down the metal stairs. Marcus burst into the room, sweeping the bunker with a massive floodlight. He found Ethan scrambling backward on the floor, pointing a trembling finger at the open door of cabinet 4. "There's a guy! He's in the panel! He's right fucking there!" Ethan choked out, his chest heaving. Marcus didn't hesitate. He charged toward the cabinet, his floodlight blindingly bright, ready to pull some idiot out of the high-voltage death trap. He shined the light directly inside. He stopped. Marcus looked into the cabinet, then looked back at Ethan on the floor. His rugged face was pale, his expression unreadable. "Ethan," Marcus said quietly, his voice lacking its usual gruffness. "There ain't nobody here." Ethan scrambled to his feet and rushed over, grabbing the doorframe of the cabinet. It was empty. There was nothing but dust, the massive bare copper bus bars, and the steady, indifferent hum of electricity. No footprints on the dusty metal floor, no torn fabric, no man. "I saw him, Marcus. I swear to God he was sitting right there. Look at my face. Do I look like I'm making a joke?" Ethan was hyperventilating, his eyes wide with panic. Marcus didn't laugh. He didn't tell Ethan he was working too hard. Instead, the big foreman slowly reached out and held his bare hand a few inches away from the live copper bus bars inside cabinet 4. "Boss," Marcus whispered, pulling his hand back. "Feel this." Ethan hesitated, then slowly reached his hand into the cabinet, hovering it over the massive copper rods. They were live. The current was flowing. By all laws of physics, those bars should be generating a significant amount of heat. But they weren't. The air inside the cabinet was freezing cold. It felt like sticking your hand into a deep freezer. And then Ethan noticed the smell. Underneath the scent of dust and ozone hanging heavily in the frozen air of the empty cabinet was the distinct, unmistakable stench of roasting meat and burnt hair. Marcus slowly pushed the heavy steel door shut and slammed the latch down. He didn't look at Ethan. "We're done for the day," Marcus said, his voice completely hollow. "Pack your gear. We are leaving. Now." Ethan didn't argue. As they walked up the stairs, leaving the bunker in total darkness, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of those milky white eyes burning into the back of his neck and the whisper of the electricity still echoing in his head. "Shut it down."
By the time the sun dragged itself over the gray Pennsylvania horizon, Ethan was already on his 3rd cup of black coffee. He tried to rationalize it. It was an optical illusion, stress, carbon monoxide poisoning from an old pipe, but logic felt flimsy against the lingering smell of roasted flesh that still seemed stuck in his nostrils. When he arrived at the Blackwood Steel Mill at 7 a.m., the temperature had dropped even further. The sky was the color of bruised iron. Marcus was already there, organizing the crew. The big foreman didn't mention what happened in the electrical bunker yesterday. He didn't even look Ethan in the eye. "Today is Sector 7, Marcus grunted, pointing his thick finger at the blueprint spread across the hood of his truck. "The vault." Sector 7 was the massive central processing floor of the mill. The workers called it the vault because of its sheer scale. The ceiling was 40 feet high, supported by thick steel trusses. Suspended from those trusses were the HVLS fans, high volume, low speed. These weren't your average ceiling fans. These were industrial behemoths, each one boasting a wingspan of 24 feet. They were designed to push massive columns of air down to the factory floor, keeping the machinery from overheating. The corporate suits in Germany wanted the 20-year-old motors replaced. That was today's job. To reach the fans, the crew had to build a heavy-duty rolling scaffold tower. It was a tedious process. Clank, bang, clank. The sound of metal poles locking together echoed through the cavernous, empty factory. The silence of the mill seemed to swallow the noise as soon as it was made. "Power's locked out and tagged out at the main breaker," Ethan confirmed, clicking his walkie-talkie. "No electricity is flowing to Sector 7. The fans are dead." But as Ethan stared up into the gloom of the high ceiling, he noticed something. The giant airplane-like aluminum blades of fan number 2 weren't dead. They were moving. It was an incredibly slow, lazy rotation. Swoosh, swoosh. "Hey, Marcus," Ethan called out, pointing his flashlight beam up at the ceiling. "I thought you said these things had automatic braking systems when the power was cut. Why is it spinning?" Marcus squinted upward. "Ghost drafts," he muttered, spitting a stream of tobacco juice onto the concrete. "The building is old. Wind gets through the broken vents in the roof, hits the huge surface area of the blades, and makes them freewheel. It ain't powered. It's just drifting." It made physical sense, but watching those massive knife-like blades slicing silently through the dark air above Ethan gave him a deep sense of vertigo. The man assigned to do the climbing was Jared. Jared was 22, a local kid who looked like he belonged on a high school football team rather than a rusted industrial site. He was fearless, agile, and always chewing a piece of peppermint gum.
All right, boss man, going up into the rafters, Jared grinned, clipping his safety harness to his tool belt. Ethan watched from the ground, holding the architectural plans. Take it slow, Jared. Tie off to the main truss as soon as you clear the scaffold platform. Those blades weigh 200 pounds each. Even freewheeling, if one hits you, it'll snap your neck.
Got it, Mom, Jared joked, and began scaling the side of the scaffold. 30 feet, 35 feet. Jared climbed higher into the shadows of the vault. From the ground, he looked small, just a silhouette moving against the massive steel skeleton of the roof. Jared reached the top platform. He stood up, carefully balancing himself. He was now eye level with the central motor housing of the giant fan. The massive aluminum blades were passing him, one by one, with that slow, hypnotic rhythm. Swoosh, swoosh. All right, Ethan, I'm at the hub. Jared's voice crackled over the radio. I'm gonna unbolt the primary housing cover, handing the radio to my belt. Ethan watched as Jared reached out with his socket wrench. To get leverage, Jared had to lean slightly over the path of the spinning blades. Up on the platform, the air was different. He could feel it. It wasn't just cold, it was electrically charged. The hair on his arms stood straight up. He could smell ozone, thick and metallic. As Jared leaned forward, one of the massive blades drifted slowly toward him. He waited for it to pass so he could reach the bolt. But as the 12-foot length of aluminum glided silently by, Jared noticed something resting on the flat, upper surface of the blade, right near the tip. It was round. It looked like a discarded bowling ball at first, sitting perfectly still as the blade carried it through the air. Jared squinted, leaning a few inches closer. His breath hitched. The peppermint gum fell from his open mouth. It wasn't a ball. It was a severed human head. The neck ended in a jagged, blackened stump, as if it had been burned off rather than cut. The face was turned away from him, the skin charcoal black, the remaining hair crisped into gray ash. Jared was frozen, his mind completely shattered. He couldn't scream. He couldn't move his hands to grab the safety rail. He just stared in pure, unadulterated horror as the massive blade slowly rotated, bringing the grotesque object closer and closer to his face. Then the head began to roll. It didn't roll off the blade. It rolled toward Jared. As it turned, the face came into view. The lips were melted away in a permanent, agonizing grin. And the eyes were wide open. They were milky, glowing pools of white. The charred, severed head stopped rolling. It stared directly into Jared's soul. Then the melted jaw snapped open, and an impossible, raspy whisper echoed not in the air, but directly inside Jared's mind. Watch your step. Jared screamed. It was a sound of pure primal terror that tore through the silence of the factory. He scrambled backward, completely forgetting where he was. His boot caught the edge of the metal platform. He didn't have time to unclip his safety line. He hadn't attached it yet. Down on the floor, Ethan saw Jared jerk violently backward. "Jared, no!" Ethan screamed. Jared tumbled over the railing. He fell 35 feet through the empty air. The sound of his body hitting the solid concrete floor was something Ethan would never, ever forget. It was a wet, heavy crack that echoed like a gunshot through Sector 7. "Call 911! Get a medic! Now!" Marcus roared, sprinting toward the crumpled body of the young worker. It was absolute chaos. Jared was alive, but barely. His legs were twisted at impossible angles. He was convulsing, blood pooling from his nose and ears. When the paramedics finally arrived, They had to strap him to a rigid backboard. His spine is severely compromised. We need an airlift, one of the medics shouted over the noise of the incoming sirens. As they were lifting the stretcher, Jared suddenly reached out. His bloody hand shot out and gripped Ethan's jacket with terrifying strength. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and frantic. "He's up there," Jared choked out, blood bubbling on his lips. "The Burt man, his head, it was on the blade, Ethan. It looked right at me." Ethan's blood ran cold. He looked up at the ceiling. The giant fan was still slowly, lazily rotating in the gloom. Swoosh. Swoosh. That evening, the factory was locked down. The police had come, taken statements, and ruled it a tragic workplace accident, a failure to use fall protection gear. But Ethan couldn't let it go. Around 9 p.m., he walked into the dusty security office near the main gate. The only person there was Kyle, a young IT guy the company hired to monitor the temporary CCTV network they had installed a week prior. "Kyle, pull up the feed for Sector 7 around 10:15 a.m., Ethan demanded, his voice shaking. Kyle, seeing the pale, haunted look on Ethan's face, didn't argue. He clicked a few keys on the keyboard. A grainy black and white feed from a camera mounted high on a steel pillar filled the screen. It showed the scaffold. It showed Jared climbing up.
Jared did not die that day, but according to the medics, he would never walk again. His body was broken, shattered by the 35-foot drop onto solid concrete. But as Ethan drove away from the Blackwood Steel Mill that evening, he knew it wasn't the fall that had broken the young man. It was what he had seen. The scorched head, the milky white eyes, the whisper that was not a sound but a direct intrusion into the mind. Blackwood was now officially a crime scene. OSHA was launching an investigation, and the mill was closed indefinitely. Ethan was ordered to return to New York until further notice. He should have been relieved. He should have wanted to run as far from Pennsylvania as possible. Instead, Ethan checked into a different motel 30 miles away from Blackwood. He bought a heavy-duty flashlight, a crowbar, and a case of energy drinks. He couldn't leave. He needed to understand. Cabinet 4, Sector 7. The entities weren't just random haunting ghosts. They were a systemic infection within the mill's grid. They were trying to stop something, yet at the same time, they were punishing any transgression against their domain. Ethan couldn't trust Marcus. The big foreman knew too much, but spoke too little. Ethan needed answers, and logic dictated that they were still within the walls of the mill. At 1 a.m., under the cover of a freezing December rain, Ethan slipped through a hole in the perimeter fence of the Blackwood Steel Mill. He wasn't the Manhattan engineer anymore. He was a trespasser, a ghost hunter, armed with nothing but a desperate need to know. He bypassed Sector B. Substation 4 was a nest he wasn't ready to poke again. He went straight for the Central Administrative Block, a 5-story concrete monolith that once housed the executives and HR records. Inside, the block smelled of moldering paper and dead water. Dust lay so thick on the tiled floors that Ethan's boots left perfect, damning prints. He found the stairs and climbed to the 4th floor, the executive level. Here the carpets were still intact, though rotted, and the heavy oak doors spoke of past power. Ethan found the door labeled HR Archives. It was locked. He didn't hesitate. He jammed the crowbar between the door and the frame and yanked. The ancient wood screamed and splintered, the noise echoing like a gunshot in the silent hallway. Ethan slipped inside. The room was a maze of rusted filing cabinets. Hundreds of thousands of files representing decades of American industrial history were left here to decay. Ethan found the section marked 1970 to 1980 and began his search.
For hours, he dug through personnel files, performance reviews, and accident reports. He drank his energy drinks, his heartbeat a frantic caffeine-drinking rhythm. He was looking for something, anything about electrical accidents, Cabinet 4, or fires. It was almost 4 a.m. when he found it. It was a manila folder, slightly singed around the edges, as if it had narrowly escaped a fire. The tab read, Miller, Arthur, deceased, September 14th, 1978. Ethan's breath hitched. He opened the folder. Arthur Miller wasn't a manager or an executive. He was a lead high-voltage electrician. In the photo attached to the file, Arthur looked to be in his late 50s. He had a stern, dedicated face, and he was wearing spectacles. He looked like a man who respected the rules, who respected the lethal potential of the power he manipulated. Below the name was a handwritten nickname in parentheticals, The Bolt. Arthur the Bolt Miller. Ethan turned the page to the incident report. Date of incident, September 14th, 1978. Sector B, Substation 4. Ethan's blood ran cold. Description of accident? Victim Miller was performing routine maintenance on MDB Cabinet 4. Due to an apparent failure to follow lockout-tagout procedures, Cabinet 4 was re-energized while the victim was inside. Victim suffered instantaneous, lethal electrocution and subsequent flash ignition. Investigation conclusion: carelessness on the part of the deceased. Ethan felt sick. Arthur Miller, the Bolt, the stern-faced rule follower, being careless on Cabinet 4? It didn't make physical sense. Arthur had raised his devotion to safety to the level of religion. He dug deeper into the file. There were dozens of petty disciplinary actions leading up to Arthur's death. Sabotage, forgotten tools, all signed by the same foreman, Foreman Thomas. Ethan realized the disciplinaries were fake, a systemic attempt to frame Arthur as negligent. Arthur Miller was being targeted. He found another page tucked in the very back of the folder. It was a single sheet of personal stationery belonging to Arthur. It wasn't a report. It was a private note Arthur had kept. It was dated just 2 days before his death. They are changing the grid configuration again. Foreman Thomas and Vice President Montgomery Sr. are pushing the kilns far past their electrical capacity. I told them Cabinet 4 cannot handle the surge. The entire MDB room will flash ignite. They told me to do my job and stop delaying production. They value profit over our lives. If something happens, if Montgomery forces Thomas to switch it on, the blood is on their hands. Thomas must not know. I cannot let Thomas know. Ethan staggered backwards, the crowbar nearly slipping from his sweaty grip. Arthur didn't die by carelessness. He was trying to prevent a catastrophic fire that VP Montgomery Sr. was willing to risk for production. And Montgomery and Thomas had silenced him. They had lured him into Cabinet 4 and carelessly switched the power on. Thomas had been the one to pull the lever. The entities weren't just vengeful, they were sentinels. Cabinet 4 was where Arthur died, scorched, becoming a part of the grid. He wasn't trying to scare Ethan, he was warning him.
Arthur knew that reactivating Cabinet 4 without restructuring the power load would lead to the same flash ignition that killed him. Arthur the Bolt was still on duty, guarding the lethal current, whispering to shut it down.
And who was Thomas, the older, devoted apprentice from his dreams? The foreman who had signed the fake reports? The man who pulled the lever? Wait, Thomas, that wasn't Marcus's name. But then again, Marcus never talked about his history. And Arthur's note said Thomas must not know. Know what? Know that the kilns would explode? Or did Arthur think Thomas was being manipulated? Arthur was Thomas's foster father, his mentor. Thomas was the devotion-filled youth in the dreams. Thomas must be... Suddenly, the silent mill seemed to shake. Ethan could hear it from HR archives, a deep, low, heavy hum of 480-volt, three-phase electricity. The mill's grid was energizing. Substation 4 was coming live. But it was closed, locked down by OSHA. Who was reactivating it? He ran. He bolted out of the archives, down the stairs, out of the administrative block, across the muddy, rain-slicked grounds, sprinting towards Sector B. Sector 7, the kilns. He knew what VP Montgomery Sr. had tried to do in 1978, and someone was trying to finish it. He had to stop them, not because of ghosts, but because the note in the HR file was physically accurate. Cabinet 4 was an electrical bomb waiting to explode. He reached Substation 4. The door was locked, chain-wrapped by OSHA. But inside, Ethan could hear the high-voltage electricity screaming like a wounded animal. Cabinet 4 wasn't just humming, it was screeching. Ozone smell was thick enough to taste. He threw his shoulder against the door. Nothing. He used the crowbar. The OSHA chain snapped with a deafening metallic clank. The door swung open. Substation 4 was bathed in an impossible, pulsating blue glow. Standing near Cabinet 4 was Marcus, the silent foreman. But Marcus wasn't standing. He was paralyzed. His massive body was locked up, muscles taut, a look of pure, unadulterated terror on his rugged face. He was looking at the cabinet. Cabinet 4's door was wide open. The entities from within had not just materialized, they had manifested. A towering pillar of scorched human flesh, a composite of every nightmare Ethan had ever had, was standing in the open cabinet. It was Arthur the Bolt Miller. The stern rule follower was no longer sitting. He was standing, not attacking Marcus, but reaching for him. The air around the entities was burning, crackling with millions of volts. Arthur was trying to pull Marcus into the lethal.
The whisper was no longer a whisper. It was a deafening, reality-splitting scream of static through the substation speakers, a scream that seemed to be simultaneously Arthur's agonizing death rattle and a judgment. "The air comes. Shut it down. All will burn." Arthur, the Bolt, was not vengeful toward Thomas, Marcus. He was trying to stop the reactivation, but his manifestation was so powerful that it was physically drawing the lethal voltage directly into Substation 4, ionizing the air, turning the room into a lethal electric field. Marcus, unable to move due to the intense electric field paralyzing his nervous system, was slowly being fried alive without even being touched. Ethan couldn't get close. He could feel the hairs on his arms standing straight up, the ozone odor stinging his eyes. If he approached Marcus, he would be killed by the electric field. He had to disable Arthur's domain, Arthur's sentinel post. He had to cut the main lockout breaker. Ethan looked across the room at the main substation breaker, the colossal lever Arthur had warned VP Montgomery about in his dream nightmare. He wants us to stop the air. Montgomery is reactivating it. But Arthur doesn't know that Thomas is Marcus. He thinks he's just preventing Thomas from killing himself. Ethan understood the tragedy. Marcus, Thomas, had spent 40 years punishing himself for killing his foster father, trying to fulfill Arthur's devotion to the mill. Marcus had let the company back in, thinking he was honoring Arthur's memory by making Blackwood run again. But Arthur had become the sentinel of Cabinet 4 to prevent the mill from running under a Montgomery heir. It was a paradox of love and haunting. And the energy was too powerful. The blue manifestation was crackling, fire starting on the electrical cables. Ethan didn't rush toward Marcus. Instead, he sprints for the main substation breaker. "I am the sentinel on duty now, Arthur," Ethan roared, not knowing if he was talking to a ghost or to a lethal electrical circuit. He grabbed the main substation lockout lever. It was a massive, rusty steel bar intended to cut all temporary power to Substation 4. He yanked it down. The lever didn't budge. The blue light got brighter, Arthur's sentinel manifestation roaring, Marcus beginning to collapse. Ethan threw his entire body weight onto the lever, screaming in frustration and fear. Clank! The lever snapped down into the lockout, tagout position. Substation 4 plunged into total darkness. The high-voltage scream of static died instantly, replaced by a deep, dead silence. The blue pulsating light vanished. Ozone smell was still heavy, but the air no longer crackled. Marcus collapsed, gasping for air, choking. Ethan rushed over, using his new heavy-duty flashlight to illuminate the foreman's face. Marcus was pale, sweating profusely, but alive.
OSHA overruled, money talks, and Montgomery Jr. shouted. Despite the horrific accident that left Jared paralyzed and the near-fatal electrical anomaly that stopped Marcus's heart, the German conglomerate, pushed by CEO Montgomery Jr., fast-tracked the renovation. They declared Substation 4 safe after a cursory inspection by non-union contractors. They claimed the ghost drafts in Sector 7 were solved by sealing the roof vents. Montgomery Jr. wanted Blackwood operational by Christmas Eve. It was a PR stunt, a symbol of the Montgomery legacy reborn. He was ignorant of the history, arrogant in his power, and completely blind to the fact that Blackwood Steel Mill was not just a building. It was a sentinel post, and the sentinel was angry. Ethan and Marcus were ordered back to Manhattan, sidelined from the final activation. They shouldn't have cared. They should have run. But the note from HR, Arthur Miller's final warning, clutched in Ethan's pocket was a heavy burden. They knew that if Montgomery Jr. fired up the main kilns without restructuring the archaic grid, Cabinet 4 would flash ignite, destroying not just Substation 4, but cascading through the entire mill. Arthur Miller, the Bolt, was ready to burn Blackwood to the ground to stop the Montgomery heir. On December 23rd, Ethan and Marcus didn't board the plane to New York. They checked into a different motel and prepared. Crowbars, flashlights, wire cutters, and heavy-duty rated electrical gloves. "We have to disconnect Cabinet 4 at the main feed," Ethan said, his voice tight, "before they energize. If power flows, Arthur will use it to destroy everything." "It's suicide," Marcus said, his voice hollow. "Cabinet 4, that's my father. He's the sentinel. He won't let us touch it." "He's not your father anymore, Marcus. He's a manifestation of a tragedy. And if we don't stop Montgomery, hundreds of people will die." Marcus nodded slowly. He served his final watch now, guarding the mill from his foster father, guarding Arthur's legacy from Montgomery, and guarding his own soul from pulling that lethal lever again. Christmas Eve, 6 p.m. Blackwood Steel Mill was illuminated by temporary spotlights. A small crowd of executives and local media gathered on the main processing floor of Sector B, near the base of the massive kilns.
Montgomery Jr., arrogant in a tailored coat, stood before a commemorative switch. Ethan and Marcus slipped through the perimeter fence near Substation 4. The mill was alive. Even without external power, Ethan could feel the dormant anger vibrating through the frozen ground. They didn't go down into Substation 4. Cabinet 4 was too powerful. Instead, they scaled the massive, ice-slicked steel ladder to the roof of Sector 7, the vault, to cut the main lines feeding into the facility at the primary step-down transformers on the roof.
Up on the roof, 40 feet above the processing floor, the wind screamed. The massive HVLS fans, the ceaseless blades, were hidden inside the structure below them. Ethan could feel Arthur's sentinel manifestation raging. The entire roof was static. Ethan's rated gloves were crackling as he pulled out his wire cutters. Below them, on the processing floor, Montgomery Jr. began his speech, broadcast over temporary speakers. "Today we reclaim our legacy. Blackwood runs again. We don't fear history, we forge it." Ethan positioned the massive insulated wire cutters over the primary 13.8 kilovolts armored cable feeding into Sector B. Marcus stood sentinel, guarding Ethan, looking down into the open roof vent into Sector 7. "Do it, Ethan!" Marcus roared over the wind. Ethan squeezed. The blade of the cutters bit into the armored insulation. Immediately the mill reacted. The high-voltage scream of static erupted from the factory speakers, a deafening rattle that was simultaneously Arthur's agonizing death cry and a judgment. "He comes! Shut it down! All will burn!" Up above, on the roof, Arthur's sentinel manifestation erupted, not as a crouching scare, but as a colossal, blinding blue force. A towering pillar of scorched human flesh and lightning materialized directly on the roof. Arthur, the bolt, in his sentinel domain. The manifestation didn't attack Ethan, it attacked the primary transformers themselves. Arthur was bypassing the network, pulling lethal voltage directly from the outside utility grid into the mill. Arthur was detonating Cabinet 4 from the other end. Down below, Montgomery Jr. commanded, ignorant of the supernatural explosion raging on the roof, "Throw the switch." A technician threw the main temporary grid switch. Power flowed in from the utility, and simultaneously Arthur's sentinel manifestation pulled in hundreds of thousands of amps of reverse voltage. Cabinet 4, locked down by OSHA, didn't just flash ignite, it detonated. The processing floor exploded in a paradoxical blue fire. The original 1978 disaster Arthur had died preventing happened in reverse. The cascading failure didn't just burn, it cascade energized every piece of metal in the factory. The massive steel kilns became lethal conductors.
Arthur Miller's soul was no longer sitting. He was sentinel on duty guarding the lethal copper bus bars. The blue sentinel stepped out of Cabinet 4's domain. He reached through the layers of the factory. Arthur didn't drag Marcus Thomas in. He bypassed Ethan and Marcus. The blue force reached directly for Montgomery Jr. Montgomery Jr., screaming in terror, was pulled through the processing floor above Substation 4 by the irresistible blue manifestation. He wasn't pulled by a hand, but by an electric field so powerful it warped reality. Montgomery was dragged to the lethal copper bus bars of Cabinet 4, the bomb that killed Arthur. Here comes. Vigil is over. Arthur's sentinel manifested, not sitting, but standing, a judge in his final court. He looked at Marcus Thomas one last time. A moment of recognition, a final warning. Then Arthur pulled Montgomery Jr. into the energized, melting copper bus bars.
The resulting explosion was blinding. Substation 4 evaporated. The cascade failure detonated Substation 7 on the roof. Sector 7's ceaseless blades spin at supersonic speed for a final second before the vortex imploded, the roof collapsing. Sector B collapsed. Ethan and Marcus were thrown from the roof, scaling down the massive ladder just as Substation 7 exploded behind them. They tumbled into the muddy, rain-slicked grounds, shielding their eyes from the paradoxical blue and orange fire engulfing Blackwood. "It's over, Arthur," Marcus whispered, choking on the smoke. Arthur's vigil was done. The Montgomery legacy was extinguished in the very bomb Arthur died trying to defuse. Jared survived his spinal injury, forever bound to a wheelchair, but his mind finally free of the burnt man's eyes. Ethan returned to Manhattan, a different engineer, a sentinel in his own right, always checking the copper bus bars for phantom voltage. He never talked about Blackwood, but he kept the HR file in his desk. Marcus spent 40 years guarding the mill from Arthur, and finally, he served his final watch, guarding Arthur from Montgomery and simultaneously preventing himself from pulling that lethal lever again. Marcus was at peace. His foster father, Arthur the Bolt Miller, the stern sentinel, was finally off duty, his vigil complete. The current of dead silence was silent now, replaced by the crackling fire of a dead industrial giant. The Montgomery air was gone, and Arthur's domain was an explosive paradox of love and haunting. The bomb was diffused by detonation. The blue sentinel of Blackwood Steel Mill was done guarding the lethal copper bar, and the current of dead silence was finally still. Vigil is over. Arthur will burn the mill down,